Okay, all you DIY philosophers out there in YouTube land, and welcome to vlog 1B. You are not the Ubermensch. Why not? Housekeeping first. I'm not really going to be using the visual component of the vlog that much, so run off and do the dishes or do some weights and negate the difference between philosophy and everyday life. The punk philosopher completely approves of that. Why am I making this vlog? Well, vlog 1A, You Are Not the Ubermensch, Beginnings, is one I very strongly suggest you watch, and not simply because of ruthless self-promotion, but also because that way this vlog will make sense. And in it I outline the difference between a Aristotelian view of truth, which is in a robust sense very traditional, which takes truth to be a matter of objectivity irrespective of our desires, versus the Nietzschean view where truth becomes our desire to assert ourselves over others. And I let the cat out of the bag in that first vlog because I suggested that, right, well, you are not the Ubermensch, not because it's hard to be the Ubermensch. In fact, the Ubermensch is an open concept. Anyone can be it. People complained. They said, well, look, you've let the cat out of the bag, you've said that there's something wrong, that you are not the Ubermensch, not because of you, but because there's something wrong with the idea of the Ubermensch, but you haven't actually criticised it, and we want at least some kind of initial criticism, and that's what I'm going to do here. So, in order to do that, we have to delve into the notion of truth itself and delve into the logic of truth. And the problem here is that and I mentioned this in the first vlog as well, that we don't want to beg the question, right? So that, like, for instance, if we're talking about propositions being true or false, we enter the domain of logic, but the two different views of truth don't have the same view of logic. So if you're Aristotelian, you like logic, and Aristotle was crucial in the development of logic because it preserves truth. Logic preserves truth through inference, through different inferences, through different arguments. Okay, and if they're logical, well, you start with true and you wind up with true. But that's only important if you think that truth is objective in the Aristotelian sense. If you're a Nietzschean and you consider the Ubermensch to be a doctrine of truth, and by the way, I think there's more to Nietzsche than this, and I'm not anti-Nietzsche. I think this idea of the Ubermensch's doctrine of truth has been harmful and we need to get over it. That's not to say I think there's nothing good in Nietzsche. Far from it. I'm a big fan of his in a lot of other ways, and perhaps in later vlogs I'll discuss that. But in terms of looking at a doctrine of truth, if you're Nietzschean, then you don't really see logic in the same way because you're not interested in preserving the same objectivity. Instead, truth is strategic, right? You're trying to something's true insofar as it's true because you're trying to assert yourself over others. And so, because truth is strategic in that sense, instead of logic simply about preserving an objective view of the world, which is correct, true, logic becomes a form of rhetoric. And as such, people who adopt the Nietzschean view of truth are more interested in social struggles and so on, and we'll talk a bit about this as we get into the vlog. And they're less interested in logic, and so as a result, the logic I'm going to start with is something that comes from the Aristotelian view of truth as objective, as irrespective of our desires. And I'm going to start with that view, but I'm going to show that actually it by no means rules out the Nietzschean view, though there are other reasons to rule out the Nietzschean view, that is, to rule out the doctrine of the Ubermensch taken as a doctrine of truth. Okay, so let's start though with a kind of a standard in that sense, and the Aristotelian view is in a sense, as much as the Nietzschean view of truth has attained this popularity, the Aristotelian view is without doubt a kind of a traditional or standard, at least in philosophy. So let's start with that. So let's say I am going to go to church. A housemate asked me, "Where are you going?" And I go, I'm going to church." Okay, so what we want here is a proposition which is capable of being thought of as true or false. Now, what I've uttered is just a sentence. It's a sentence in everyday life, right? I'm off to church. I'm an atheist, but we'll come to that. Okay, so I'm off to church. Now, when I utter that proposition, when I utter that sentence, it's not necessarily a proposition. We have to kind of like interpret the sentence to become a proposition which then is either true or false, that is, bears a truth value. And in the case of I'm off to church, there's not really that much interpretation to be done. The sentence, I'm off to church, where are you going? I'm off to church. We might want to get rid of the I bit because some I's won't be off to church, right? So we might want to translate the I bit into indexical. Is a technical term there. We might want to translate that indexical off into something like Gerald Keeney is off to church. And Gerald Keeney is off to church will be true if Gerald Keeney is off to church, and false otherwise. So how does this work in a bit more detail? Okay, well, one way this works in a bit more detail is one way to see it. And look, I'm not saying I'm giving a definitive, rigorous analysis of truth making. And you know, feel free in the comments to take me up if you think I'm remiss. I'm the punk philosopher. I'm just trying to get at the ideas and trying to get at what's happening in contemporary culture, especially. So the way it is sort of as true is that we get a truth-bearing proposition. Gerald Keeney's off to church, and there is either true or false based on what states of the world obtain. So if Gerald Keeney is off to church, then the proposition Gerald Keeney is off to church is true. That is, if the state of the world is such that Gerald Keeney is off to church obtains, then the proposition Gerald Keeney is off to church is true, and it's false otherwise. Sorry, I made a bit of a meal of it, but it's not actually that complicated, though we will find there is room for theoretical manoeuvre here. So just stick around. Don't think it's all just trivial and tautological. Okay, so a state of the world obtains where Gerald Keeney is off to church, and the proposition Gerald Keeney is off to church is true if that state of the world obtains, and false otherwise. So the state of the world obtaining, it is the case that Gerald Keeney is off to church, is a truth maker, and it makes the proposition Gerald Keeney is off to church either true or false. We're just going to deal with two truth values here. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that there's more than two truth values, but in terms of traditions, as I've been talking about the Aristotelian tradition, I guess that two truth values is very dominant, and it's all we need. That's all we need. Dominant and all we need. Okay, and so we've got here quite an Aristotelian picture. All right, I mean it's the case that a certain state of the world obtains, and so the proposition Gerald Keeney is off to church is true. There might be just on the issue of translating a sentence to a truth-bearing proposition. We might need to do more than just get rid of the indexicals. For instance, let's say the housemate yelled out, "Where are you off to, mate?" And I go, "Church." Well, then we might want to kind of like interpret that a bit more thoroughly to say Gerald Keeney is off to church. But this stuff's not. Surely this isn't that important for what's going on here. But just so we're all on the same page. Okay. Now, that's quite Aristotelian. States of the world that they seem to obtain or not obtain on the basis, not on the basis of our desires, but just on an objective basis. So how are we going to translate that into a Nietzschean view? Okay, good question. Well, we'd want something like Gerald Keeney's off to church. The truth maker for Gerald Keeney's off to church is something like Gerald Keeney's off to church because he's trying to assert himself over others. Okay. Now look, maybe this is one reason this hasn't been taken up that much in the literature, because it just seems kind of nuts, right? But actually, really, and you know, I'm going to be arguing against the doctrine that you mentioned as a doctrine of truth, but actually, it's not as dumb as it seems. So I mentioned I'm an atheist. Okay, so in that case, jockeying is off to church. Would be. I stand for certain things. I don't want other people doing certain things. I'm asserting myself over them. And even the same could be true of something like Gerald is off to Liquorland. You know, like, I'm going to let myself go. Don't get in my way. Okay. So this idea of a truth maker and making a truth-bearing proposition true or false is not as inimical to the Nietzschean view as we might think, and that's why we're going to have to try and kind of like figure out what's the best way to talk about truth and falsity and true and false propositions. Okay, so you might say, well, look, you know, you've come up with a couple of examples here, like, you know, off to church and off to the bottle shop, and you've reduced these to assertions over others, or you've at least shown how they could be understood in those terms. But aren't they just kind of, you know, examples, cherry-picked examples, or hand-picked examples? Okay, so that's a reasonable worry. The first thing I want to say about this is, it's kind of funny though, like, you know, a lot of literature, for instance, can be analysed in a Nietzschean framework. Now, let's take Jane Austen, okay? She actually wrote before Nietzsche was born, but that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter, and I hope you get that doesn't matter. I'm not going to go into why it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter. Okay, because we're just talking about truth and falsity in a trans-historical sense. Okay, she was interested in how women were resisting becoming pawns in a dynastic game. And so what's said in the Jane Austen books, in the drawing rooms, can be interpreted in Nietzschean lines. You know, like the woman, she's a kind of Ubermensch, and I talked a bit about the Ubermensch in the first vlog. Nietzsche didn't like it. Created a bit of confusion about the openness of the concept. His historical confusion about the openness of the concept, but that's not relevant. We can't have the Ubermensch because it's an open concept, and anyone can adopt it as an idea of truth. That truth is about assertion. And so there she is doing her assertion, and we could read Jane Austen like that if we so wanted. And more than that, we could go on and we could understand sociology, which is often thought about as social struggles, you know, beginning, I guess, with more Marxist ideas of class struggle, but certainly coming to that idea of for instance, women's struggles, and same with media studies, and a whole gamut of the whole gamut, in fact, of the humanities can be thought of in terms of this idea of asserting something and it being true insofar as we are asserting ourselves over others. So in terms of a Nietzschean rather than Aristotelian truth. That's not news, and that's part of what I'm talking about in terms of against this Aristotelian tradition, the whole idea that we wind up with this open concept diffusing through society, including through academia. Of course, I'm not limiting myself to academia, I'm the punk philosopher, but okay, it's there. Now, Nietzschean view of truth has had a lot of success in the humanities, but where it hasn't had success so much is in the sciences. Okay, and so we hit a kind of a funny point here. Why hasn't it had success in the sciences? Well, scientists tend to think of themselves. I mean, sorry, this is a broad generalisation, but scientists tend to think of themselves as trying to find an objective truth, which is objective in that it is true irrespective of their desires, and that's incompatible with the Nietzschean view. And often scientists appeal to evidence on exactly this basis, and that's a long-running thing going right back to, you know, at least Enlightenment philosophers, you know, David Hume being an obvious example. So the sciences traditionally haven't been domains in which the Nietzschean view of truth has been accepted. However, that certainly changed to some extent recently, including in popular culture. I was just watching the Nick Cave. I was just listening to that Nick Cave song, the Higgs Boson Blues, which seems like quite like this kind of thing, like an attempt to understand science in terms of what it matters to people on the basis of personal assertion. And certainly I hope in later vlogs to come back to countercultural figures like Henry Rollins, Nick Cave and others who certainly punch above their weight in terms of not being too explicit about what they're saying and yet at the same time being highly influential and dispersing this open concept of a Nietzschean view of truth through culture. Okay, so what do I think is going on here? Well, I think it's certainly true that. Sorry, I shouldn't say that, right? You've got to be careful when you're talking about the truth, right? And what I'll say is this: that certainly, if we're in the sciences, certainly we can understand the sciences along the lines of assertion over others. So, for instance, traditionally the sciences have often been understood as the domain of white, middle-class, heterosexual men, cis men, I suppose you'd say now as well. And that understanding of the sciences gives you an idea of sort of assertions of truth, and that's been a very common thing in recent radical philosophical discourse in counterculture. It's met kind of like problems as well in that the sciences are open in a way as well, right? Like, and that is that, you know, for instance, let's just take astronomy. Probably one of the major figures in contemporary astronomy is Vera Rubin, and if you've heard of a Chandrasekhar limit, it's a way to describe the black hole. And it refers to a Indian philosopher, a subcontinental Indian philosopher. So certainly that idea that science is kind of a white male middle class prerogative, it has been problematised, but not in a way that really endangers the Nietzschean idea of truth, right? The Ubermensch considered as a doctrine of truth. Why not? Well, because then it just means that other people can assert themselves using science. So actually, the sciences don't have to form this bulwark. It's not obvious, let's say that. I want to argue against the Nietzschean idea of truth, but it's not obvious that the sciences form this bulwark against the Nietzschean of truth just by dint of their historical claims to objectivity. Another thing is, another way we might think about this as well, and I'm hoping to take this up in later vlogs as well, especially Henry Rollins has some good stuff about the Nietzschean view of truth in kind of street fights, right? And I think, you know, if you're in a street fight, you probably want to know biomechanics, you want to know kind of equal and opposite reactions and stuff. And so, on that basis as well, you know, you're going to say, well, look, I'm accepting science, but as a way of asserting myself over others, so, you know, quite viscerally in a street fight, perhaps. In terms of giving orders, say, or giving commands in a workplace or in an army situation or something like that. Like the Nietzschean view seems pretty comfortable, yeah, because if I say you will hoist the flag up the flagpole, I make it true by dint of my assertion of power over you. Well, I'm not going to use that word power, sorry. Let's try and keep it simple. That's true by dint of the fact that I've asserted myself over you, and it's about my self-assertion. I consider whatever identity I'm involved in, and this is something I talked about in the first blog as well, like, you know, whatever kind of alliances I'm in, that I'm asserting myself over you on the basis of the flag going up the flagpole, and you put the flag up the flagpole because I assert myself over you, right? Of course, I'm not going to dwell too much on these everyday life examples on account of the fact that the Aristotelian can equally go, well, look, you know, there are objective reasons behind all of this. There's objective reasons behind the way that the army functions, and there's objective facts about the flag and so on. So it's not decisive. But even though it's not decisive, in fact, because it's not decisive, what we've got is kind of a Mexican standoff, right? Like any statement, it looks like, in any field, it looks like, can be either interpreted along Aristotelian objectivist lines where your desires don't matter, or they can be interpreted along Nietzschean lines. Before I go any further on this Mexican standoff, I think we're in a good position now to see that the Nietzschean view can actually fit this kind of truth maker schema. It's just that the truth makers aren't about states of the world, but are about states of the world where I'm asserting myself over others. I mean, what's happened here is that even though that logical technology of talking about states of the world obtaining or not obtaining, and truth makers and truth-bearing propositions comes out of an Aristotelian perspective, it doesn't rule out a Nietzschean perspective. Okay, so we wind up with a sort of a standoff. And there's one way I think we can understand this standoff, and it's this. Imagine two people engaged in a language game, right? And the first one goes, I don't want to play this language game anymore, right? And the second one goes, well, you're only saying that, you do want to play this language game, and you're only saying that to make me feel indebted to you. It's just a game to kind of assert yourself over me in the language game. The first one goes, no, I don't want to play the language game anymore. And the second one goes, well, look, you've just upped the ante. You've just put that same strategy, and it is a strategy and it is strategic, on steroids. And there's no way out unless the first person, right? And I mean, the second person who thinks that it is all just about a way of making them feel indebted, and so of a way of asserting themselves over that second person, could be right. But let's say they're wrong, right? Let's say they're wrong. They could be right. Let's say they're wrong. If they're wrong, then the first person can prove it by just kind of bowing out, right? That is taking action to not be involved in something. They're still taking action. Oh fuck, I've lost the sound here. You're going to have to get bad sound from the camera, sorry. It's the batteries. Oh, doesn't matter. Gavin Finley, if you watch this, I did try to get a better sound quality for this vlog. I've effed it. Alright, anyway, so what's happening here is that it seems as though it's very hard to distinguish whether a proposition is any proposition. Put it this way: any proposition can be interpreted as being of an objectivist character, or equally as being a move in a competitive move to assert yourself over someone else. And so it looks like, short of action, and we're coming to that, there's no real way to distinguish. Hey, with the standoff, that's where we're at now. One way I think around this is to look at the idea of labour. Okay, so here's what I mean by this. In order for there to be people asserting themselves over others, there has to be a society. Okay, now in order for that society to exist, there has to be we have to remake the world. We have to labour remakes the world. Paid work is a form of this. It's by no means the best form, and certainly not the most, and certainly not an inevitable form, but it's a form of this. Now, if that doesn't happen, there's going to be no Ubermensch or no anything else. That at least has to happen. Now, what happens when we labour? What happens when we remake the world? I don't want to go into the thermodynamics. I love the thermodynamics, and I think the thermodynamics are really important. But basically what we're doing is we're pushing the world into the unlikely states where it enables human society to flourish. And so we're confronting the world. But see, the thing is, and this is really the point I'm going to be making here, is that this is not the same as the assertion of power of one individual over another in the sense of the Ubermensch. Because nature is not another will in a battle of wills. It just isn't. Okay. Now, maybe sometimes it looks like it kind of is, like maybe when you're training animals. But if we're talking about sort of fertilising soil, or we're talking about water pressure, we're talking about electrical stuff, like, no, it's not the same. You, in order to get the result you want from nature, you do what nature wants, right? But you do it in a way in which it comes out benefiting you. And it just doesn't seem like a will-to-will power relationship. Sorry, I'm not supposed to be using that term power. I keep slipping into it. It's in no way clear that we've got any kind of adequate analogy between human wills and natural will. As much as I think we might be able to get something poetic out of vitalism and the rest of it. Taken with a grain of salt, of course, and properly understood. And, you know, we're in danger of anthropomorphizing otherwise, I would have thought. Okay. Now, if this is right, then labour is better understood through an Aristotelian truth condition. But hang on. Labour informs everything. Like, it informs the drawing room dramas in the Jane Austen book. It informs what's discussed in the sociology. It informs what's happening in media studies, right? All of those things are versions of labour. And even science, right? One way to understand science is not so much about a way of producing knowledge. Science is itself a form of labour, okay? And you can talk about, as Nietzscheans have done, that there's different ways of interpreting the sense data, for instance, which adds impetus to their case that really the sciences are about truth only considered as the scientists asserting themselves over others. But the fact is that that all of that stuff, the gathering of data and the working upon of the world to obtain information is itself a form of labour. Now, if this is right, then labour is a very good reason to believe that we should prefer the Aristotelian over the Nietzschean truth condition. And look, there's a lot of questions unanswered here, which I hope to go into in later vlogs. I hope this has been helpful. Stay safe and watch out for my other vlogs on You Are Not Ubermensch.